Welcome back to Chapter 11 in Biology 2210 at CNM. We left off last time talking about a muscle twitch, and we saw that when you look at an individual muscle cell, if you stimulate it with enough voltage in the laboratory, you will get something known as a muscle twitch. And a muscle twitch consists of a latent period, the time it takes for all the intracellular processes to take place within the cell to begin contraction, and then of course the contraction phase itself, and then a longer relaxation phase. We saw if the voltage is not strong enough, in other words if it's a subthreshold stimulus, that you won't get any contraction at all, but if you have a voltage that's strong enough, you will get a muscle twitch. One thing I didn't mention last time is that for individual cells, muscle cells, muscle twitches are all or nothing phenomena. In other words, it either happens or it doesn't. So we don't have different sizes of muscle twitches. For a single cell, you don't have any sort of graded response. In other words, you don't have contraction force or duration of different lengths or size. It's an all or nothing phenomenon. A muscle cell is either going to twitch or it's not going to twitch if it achieves threshold stimulation. Now we did see that there are some factors that can affect the force of a muscle cell's contraction, and this is where we left off last time with objective number 120. Status of fatigue, the length-tension relationship, TREPI, which was the relationship between the muscle's temperature and its contraction strength, and other factors as well can influence slightly the strength of an individual cell's contraction. But all else being equal, muscle twitches are essentially all or nothing phenomena, and depending on environmental conditions, they're going to happen and they're not going to happen, or they're not going to happen and they're going to happen at the same strength given the same conditions. So in 121, excuse me, we asked the interesting question: if an individual muscle cell can only contract or not contract, how is it that when we look at the behavior of whole muscles, a biceps muscle or a gluteus muscle, that the whole muscle functions in a graded fashion? And what I mean by that is that with a whole muscle, we certainly do have the capacity to contract it a little bit or a lot. We can create a weak contraction or a strong contraction. And we can also vary the duration of contraction. We can contract it for a short period of time, or we can choose to contract it for a long period of time and maintain contraction, such as in postural muscles, fixator muscles. So the question is, how is it that an organ that's composed of all or nothing units, the muscle cells, can function in a graded fashion? Well, the answer to this question is a phenomenon known as summation. What is summation? Summation is a way of combining muscle cell contractions to produce a whole muscle response. Summation is how we combine individual muscle cell twitches to create the whole muscle response. And depending on how we combine these individual cell twitches, we are going to get various kinds of responses from the muscle. And of course, this is advantageous that muscles be able to contract with variable strength and duration, because most of what we do with our muscles doesn't involve a single all or nothing twitch of a muscle that lasts less than a second. There's very little that we could do if that's all our muscles could do. So we absolutely need to be able to vary the strength, to be able to lift objects of different weight, and we need to be able to vary the duration, to sometimes hold a contraction for long periods of time. Again, these are our postural muscles, or when we're holding a bag, or anything that requires a sustained contraction. So there are actually two different kinds of summation that we're going to talk about that affect muscle behavior. Again, excuse me. And these two types of summation are referred to as multiple motor unit summation and temporal summation. And there's actually several different names for each of these two different kinds of summation. We're going to start with the concept of multiple motor unit summation. So right now we're on objective 125. Multiple motor unit summation can also be referred to as recruitment. Another name for multiple motor unit summation that you'll see in some books is spatial summation. Spatial as in space, S-P-A-T-I-A-L, spatial summation. Recruitment is probably the best term because it most accurately describes what's going on. But multiple motor unit summation is also nice because it does include the word summation, so that reminds us what we're talking about. At any rate, multiple motor unit summation is the kind of summation, first of all, that is going to affect the force of contraction. Multiple motor unit summation does not affect the duration of contraction, how long a muscle remains contracted, but it does influence the force of the contraction. Now, the way we illustrate multiple motor unit summation in the lab is by stimulating the muscle with higher voltages. If we stimulate the muscle with greater and greater voltages, what we see is that the force of the contraction increases. So there's something about the signal strength, the higher voltage, that causes the whole muscle to somehow contract more forcefully. The question is, why is this happening? What happens? Well, in objective 126, what we see an explanation of how multiple motor unit summation occurs in the body. Remember, voltage is artificial. Just in the lab, hitting a muscle with voltage is artificial. What actually is happening in the muscle, the increasing stimulus means we actually have more nerve fibers, more axons sending messages to the muscle. And remember, there is this concept of the motor unit. A motor unit is a single motor neuron and all the muscle cells it innervates. This is from a previous objective. And also recall, we have smaller motor units, sometimes just one axon serving a few cells. And we can also have very large motor units, a single axon serving perhaps hundreds of muscle cells at once. And what happens in multiple motor unit summation is simply that if we need more strength, if we need more force of a muscle contraction, we recruit more motor units in that muscle. We simply turn on more motor units. And so if we need a very weak contraction, we only send a signal down a few axons and we only stimulate a few motor units. If we need more contraction strength, then we send a nerve signal, an action potential, down more axons, activating more motor units. And as more motor units get turned on, of course, the force of the whole muscle's contraction will increase. And so literally, it's a process whereby we recruit more and more motor units to activate. And this is what increases the force of contraction. Again, in the lab, we do this simply with voltage. Higher voltages will automatically stimulate more motor units because it stimulates more axons in the muscle. But under natural conditions, this is done by our brain, deciding how many motor neurons to send messages through. And so this is a very simple explanation of how we primarily affect the force of contraction. The more muscle cells or motor units we stimulate, the stronger the contraction. And I think there's some value in appreciating that there is a size principle upon which this works. So when a muscle first begins to contract, we start the contraction by activating the smallest motor units first. And if those are not enough to move the load or accomplish the task, then we start calling into play the next largest motor unit. And then after that, the next largest motor unit, and so on. We do this automatically until we have stimulated enough motor units to cause a force of contraction that's strong enough to do the job we need to do. And this happens all the time, again, at a level that you're not completely conscious of. So when you, say, try to lift a book off a desk, there's a short period of time during which you're starting to recruit motor units to do the job. And without realizing it, you start with the smallest ones, and your body, through proprioception, again, some awareness of its own position, is evaluating whether the load is being moved or not. And based on that feedback, we have very quick multiple motor unit summation that takes place that recruits more and more motor units until I'm able to move the book. It's amazing, really, that all this happens in a fraction of a second in order for us to get the job done. Now, again, in the lab, how we demonstrate multiple motor unit summation is by stimulating a muscle with increasing voltage. So what we see here is that this upper graph represents the actual voltage applied to the muscle. And so the first burst of stimulus is a relatively small voltage, and then we hit it with a slightly larger voltage, right? So this could be 1 volt, this could be 2 volts, this could be 3 volts, and so on. We're just increasing the voltage of the stimulus. And notice down here on the bottom graph, we have the muscle's response to that voltage. Again, this is in the lab scenario, but it illustrates multiple motor unit summation nicely. So if I hit it with a small voltage that's subthreshold, remember, some voltages are so weak that they're not enough to cause a noticeable contraction. And so in this dotted line, we see the threshold voltage, the minimum voltage you need to actually get a response. So if this voltage is subthreshold, remember, what are we going to see in the muscle? Well, nothing, because it's subthreshold, not enough to cause a response. The second voltage is a little higher, but still subthreshold, and again, we see nothing. Excuse me. By the time we get to the third stimulus, where the voltage has now reached threshold intensity, we see a response of the muscle. Now, this is, again, not a muscle twitch. Muscle twitch is what happens in a single cell. In this graph, we're looking at the tension or force created by the entire muscle. So it's a slightly different kind of graph than what we looked at earlier with the muscle twitch. It's a whole muscle's response. And so we see the muscle generate some force and then relaxes. And what we see then is we continue to increase the voltage. We see an increase in the force of contraction of the muscle. This is multiple motor unit summation, that increase in the force of contraction as we recruit more and more motor units. This represents the nerve that's serving the muscle, and you can see with a subthreshold stimulus, no axons in the nerve are firing, so no muscles are going to be stimulated. Once we hit threshold, at least one axon is firing, and so that's going to stimulate at least one motor unit, again, usually the smallest to begin with. And as we need more force, we simply start sending signals down more neurons, activating ultimately more motor units in the muscle. You will notice, however, that as we continue to increase the voltage, we do reach a point at which the force of contraction doesn't increase anymore. So as volts went up here, contraction strength went up here. But then when we got to the 7th stimulus, we hit a contraction strength, and then after that, even though we increased the voltage, we didn't get an increase in the force of contraction. So basically what's happening at this point, at stimulus number 7, is the muscle is maxing out. And this is known as the maximum contraction. This strength, this amount of tension that the muscle generates here is called the maximum contraction of the muscle. This is the strongest contraction this muscle can generate. Now, why doesn't it keep going up if I increase the voltage from this point on? Well, notice what happens at stimulus number 7. At stimulus number 7, all of the axons in the nerve serving the muscle have been excited, which means all of the motor units in the muscle are contracting. There are no more motor units to recruit. In other words, every cell in that muscle served by this nerve is going to be contracting. And so it doesn't matter if I increase voltage any longer. I've already stimulated all the motor units that the muscle has. And so increasing voltage isn't going to make a difference at that point. And so multiple motor unit summation does work up to the point of maximal contraction. Once you hit maximum contraction, then there's going to be no more summation because literally the muscle is maxed out and can't contract anymore. And so every muscle in the body has a maximal response or a maximal contraction. That's the greatest force that that muscle can generate in a given set of environmental conditions. Okay, so that's primarily how we affect the force of contraction, but we also said that we're going to use the concept of summation to affect the duration of contraction, how long the muscle stays contracted. And you'll notice here in multiple motor unit summation, we really haven't affected the length of contraction significantly. We're still getting just isolated contractions and responses of muscle. We're not creating a sustained contraction. So there must be a different kind of summation that we use to affect the duration of contraction. This type of summation that affects the duration of contraction is known as temporal summation. And we see this here in objective 130. Temporal summation. As with multiple motor unit summation, temporal summation does have another name. It is also known as wave summation. So temporal or wave summation. In the lab, the way we would demonstrate temporal or wave summation is not by altering the voltage of the stimulus. We would keep that the same. So we would find what a threshold level voltage is and make sure we just apply a stimulus that's at least threshold to the muscle. And what we would vary instead is the frequency of the stimulation. In other words, instead of just applying isolated bursts of stimuli to the muscle, we would hit the muscle with a particular frequency of stimuli per second. Remember, frequency is how many times an event occurs per time unit. And so in the lab, we might hit the muscle with 1 stimulus per second and see what happens. And then we might hit it with 3 stimuli per second. And then we might hit it with 5 stimuli per second, and so on. And watch the muscle's response. What we're going to see when we alter the frequency of stimulation is something like this. On these graphs, what we have on the x-axis, again, is, in this case, the stimulus being applied. And on the y-axis, we have the amount of force or tension that the muscle is generating. And so if we start with a constant voltage, again, throughout all of these graphs, we're using the same voltage, say 5 volts. What we're altering, again, is how frequently we stimulate the muscle. And so here, in this first scenario, we're stimulating the muscle at a very low frequency, maybe once per second. And what we see is that upon the first stimulus, we see the muscle contracts and then relaxes completely. Then it gets hit with a second stimulus and it contracts again, relaxes completely, and so on. Excuse me. So these are just isolated muscle twitches. There's no summation occurring here at all. However, if we look at the second graph, you'll notice that in this time period between the first and second stimulus here, now we have not just 2 stimuli, but we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, about 4 or 5 stimuli in that time period, right? So this might be a stimulus frequency of 5 per second, or maybe even higher, maybe 10 per second. Notice what happens to the muscle contraction at this point. We stimulate the muscle with the first stimulus, and we see a contraction. And as usual, we see a relaxation. But notice, before the muscle can completely relax, it gets hit again with a second stimulus because now they're coming pretty rapidly. And so before the muscle completely relaxes, it starts another contraction. So notice right here, the muscle never actually returned to a complete resting point before it started to contract again. So technically, we haven't allowed the muscle to relax completely. We've allowed it to relax a little, but it hasn't completely relaxed, and so we've begun to affect the duration of a contraction. And the same thing happens on the next contraction cycle. It gets contracted by this stimulus, this second stimulus, contracts, relaxes, but again, before it can relax all the way, it gets hit with the third stimulus, and so on and so forth. And you see each successive contraction essentially piggybacks on the one before it, so that it never fully relaxes. And this piggybacking effect causes the force of contraction, the sustained force of contraction, to gradually rise. So even though the muscle is quivering, it is contracting, relaxing, contracting, relaxing, contracting, relaxing. So it's a quivering kind of contraction. Notice the muscle never returns to complete relaxation, which would be way down here. So we have a sustained contraction. Even though it's twitchy, it is a sustained contraction. Right? The muscle never returns to a complete resting state. So as long as we keep hitting the muscle with this high stimulus frequency, that's gonna prevent it from relaxing. This is known as temporal summation. And this kind of twitchy, sustained contraction is referred to as incomplete tetany. Incomplete tetany. And this you see in Objective 133. You'll notice I call it incomplete tetany. Your book calls it incomplete tetanus. Both are correct. I prefer the word tetany because I think too often people confuse tetanus with a disease state. Tetanus is uncontrollable muscle contraction caused by a bacterial toxin from the genus Clostridium. It's also known as lockjaw. And it's deadly because all your muscles basically contract and can't relax because of this bacterial toxin, and you will die. Your diaphragm, for instance, will seize up and you can't breathe anymore. So that's a very dangerous condition, tetanus or lockjaw. I don't want you to think that this is an abnormal situation, what we're observing here. This is a completely normal situation, what we're seeing here, when the body does it voluntarily. So that's why I prefer the term tetany, because it's not as easy to associate with the medical condition tetanus. At any rate, this is known as incomplete tetany because the muscle isn't maintaining a smooth, consistent state of contraction. It's, as I said, a twitchy contraction. And if you think about it, there are very few scenarios in which this would be a useful kind of sustained contraction. Usually when we want to sustain a contraction, we want to sustain it smoothly. So for instance, a postural muscle that's on your back and in the back of your neck that's holding your head up right now, in order to be able to read what you're looking at, your head has to be held still so that your eyes can focus. You don't want your head twitching up and down. That's going to make reading a stationary slide very difficult. So it's not the ultimate goal of temporal summation to create this incomplete tetany. The ultimate goal of temporal summation is to create a state of smooth, sustained contraction where the muscle maintains a force, a tension way up here, and we don't see any twitching. It's a smooth state of contraction. This is called complete tetany. That's the goal, is to create complete tetany. How do we do that? Well, notice what's changed here. We've taken this frequency of stimulation and we've simply increased it. And again, your book says unnaturally high stimulus frequency. I wouldn't call it unnatural in any way. We're doing this all the time with our postural muscles. So I would cross out the unnaturally. I'm not sure why they put that there. But when we fire signals to our motor units at a very high frequency, we'll get a little initial twitch for a few milliseconds, and then what's going to happen is the stimuli are coming so rapidly that the muscle cells, the motor units, do not get a chance to completely relax before they get hit again with a stimulus. This time, essentially, they don't get a chance to relax at all. And so the muscles remain, the muscle cells and the motor units, I should say, remain in a state of perpetual contraction or smooth sustained contraction. What's actually happening is some motor units are relaxing a little while others are being recruited. And so the combination of that creates macroscopically a smooth sustained contraction. And it's simply due to this high frequency. So this is what we're after in temporal summation, is a state of smooth sustained contraction called complete tetany, and we're doing it all day long in various muscles in the body. You will notice that not only did temporal summation affect the duration of contraction, notice that it's also affected the force of contraction slightly. Look, these isolated muscle twitches only could contract with this much force. But notice how much tension we're at with the complete tetany response, way up here. So we're actually also increasing slightly the force of contraction. And again, this is because of the piggyback effect. Each twitch piggybacks on the one before it, and that staircase effect helps increase the force as well. But temporal summation is not the principal way we affect force of contraction. Remember, that's multiple motor unit summation for force of contraction. This we use primarily to affect duration of contraction. Now, in the body, these two types of summation are not an either-or proposition. It's not that you can just do one or the other. We use both of these consistently and together to create muscle response. So again, to use the example of lifting a book off the desk, when I first begin to lift the book off the desk, I'm using multiple motor unit summation to determine exactly how much force I need to lift that book. Once I lift the book and get it into a position I want, where I'm holding it, then I start using temporal summation to create complete tetany, which will hold the book in a nice steady position, say if I'm reading it. So we use both of these types of summation together all the time. Okay, so we understand now how muscles act in terms of altering their force and duration of contraction. We're going to now change gears slightly with objective 137. And we're going to start with a little note here and then talk about a couple of phenomena that are based on that note. The note is, again, 137. Contraction. Muscle contraction refers to the generation of tension, the generation of force. And that force is usually applied to a bone, and that force may or may not move the bone. And it's important to understand that that may or may not part. So notice the second part of objective 137. It says may not. It's a typo. It should be may not. Always translates to muscles shortening. Muscles can contract, which means generate force, without shortening. Right? And again, this happens all the time during, say, something like complete tetany, where I'm maintaining posture. Your muscles are working, but they're not necessarily shortening because they're not moving anything. This happens, for instance, if you're carrying a suitcase. Let's say you need to stand in line at the airport and for some reason you can't put your suitcase down. Eventually, what's going to happen? Your muscles will fatigue. Your muscles will tire, especially if it's a heavy enough suitcase. Why? Well, not because you were moving the suitcase. You were simply holding it in place. But you had to generate force to hold it up off the ground against gravity. The muscle was doing work, even though there was no movement associated with that work. So that's a nice illustration of how muscles can work to generate force and tension without necessarily shortening and creating movement. So once we understand that concept, that muscle contraction is the generation of tension, not necessarily the generation of movement, we can then understand two different kinds of contraction that we see in this slide, isometric muscle contraction and isotonic muscle contraction. Isometric muscle contraction is muscle contraction that produces tension but does not produce movement. In other words, the muscle contracts but it doesn't shorten. So the way you remember this is you just have to remember what these words iso and metric mean. Iso, of course, means equal or the same. Metric means distance, like a meter, right? It's a metric unit of distance. So isometric, same length, same distance, same length. And so what that tells me is that the muscle is contracting, but the length of the muscle is not changing. It's isometric. So why do we do this? Again, this is most common in postural muscles, where we're just holding a contraction to hold position. and that's really the most common case in which we do it. In some people, there are exercise regimens that are largely isometric. So for instance, if you were to take the palms of your hands and press them together in front of your chest and then push, you would feel your muscles, a variety of arm and chest muscles working, though with the equal force, one hand pushing against the other, there wouldn't be any movement. And you would not be able to do that for very long, especially if you're pushing as hard as you can. And so that's an illustration that, again, you're doing work, expending energy, creating tension, but it's isometric. There's no movement associated with it. The more typical kind of contraction that we think about when we think about muscle contraction is isotonic muscle contraction. Isotonic contraction occurs when the muscle does shorten with the contraction. So the muscle does change in length. And so this happens when the force of the contraction does not equal the load. The load is the resistance to the muscles changing shape, changing length. The load, in other words, is the thing we're trying to move, like a book or a suitcase or whatever it is we're trying to move with a muscle contraction. It might just be the body. So the load is the resistance we're trying to overcome. Notice in isometric contraction, the force the muscle produces is essentially the same as the load, and that's why there's no movement. In isotonic muscle contraction, the force of contraction is not the same as the load, and so therefore there's going to be movement. Now, most people, when they hear this, they automatically think that isotonic muscle contraction involves the muscles shortening. But that's not necessarily always the case. Remember, isotonic simply says that the muscle is going to change length. That change in length could be a decrease in length, a shortening, or it could be an increase in length, a lengthening of the muscle. Because in our description, we just said the muscle changes length. We didn't say it shortens during contraction. So there's actually two different kinds of isotonic muscle contraction. There's what we call concentric contraction and eccentric contraction. What's the difference? Well, concentric contraction is what we usually think of when we think of muscle contraction. The muscle shortens as it works against a load. And so what we're doing in concentric contraction is we're generating a certain amount of force, tension, and that amount of tension is greater than the load, more force than we need. And so what happens is we end up shortening and moving the load. This is what we do when we lift some kind of object, like lifting a weight. And again, this is what most people think of when they think of contraction. But on this slide, you can see contraction can mean multiple things. Muscle contraction can mean no change in length, or it can mean shortening, as we usually think of. But notice, there's also eccentric muscle contraction. And in this case, the muscle lengthens as it contracts. And this might be a little confusing to you, but really all we're saying here is that the force that the muscle is generating is less than the load. It's not enough to equal the load, and so not only does it not move the load in a shortening way, the load itself, the resistance, actually ends up stretching the muscle out a little bit because the muscle's not strong enough to resist it. And so this is where muscles lengthen even though they're still generating tension and doing work. So this would happen, for instance, when you're lowering a weight. So you've lifted something with a concentric contraction, then you decide to put it back down. You have to lengthen your muscle back out under control to lower the weight back to its position. So this is known as an eccentric contraction. You reduce the tension so that the load becomes greater than the tension, and the load stretches the muscle out, lengthens it back out. Anybody who's done any kind of weightlifting is intimately familiar with these two kinds of contractions. In the weightlifting language, this is usually referred to as the positive and the negative in a particular movement. So if you're doing a biceps curl, for instance, when you lift the weight up on the first part of the exercise, that's a concentric contraction. Your arms start out straight and you bend your elbows, you flex your elbows, and the weight comes up towards the chin, right? So the muscle in your arm is shortened. That's concentric. That's the positive. The negative then would be the opposite, where you extend the elbows and return the weight back to its starting position down by your hips, right? And if you're doing correct weightlifting, you don't just let the bar fall back down to its initial position. Not only does that not help work the muscle, but it's dangerous. You know that you try to resist the weight as it's lowering back down. That work you're doing on the negative side of the movement is called eccentric contraction. And to get the most out of weightlifting, you want to not just focus on the concentric contraction, but you also want to focus on the eccentric contraction. And this is one of the ways you can modify your workouts, is to alter the duration of concentric and eccentric contraction. And one of the best ways to get muscles to respond in general is to not do the same thing over and over and over again, but to vary it up. And so some people vary the amount of weight they use in their exercises from week to week. Some people vary, of course, the kinds of ways that they challenge a muscle with different exercises. Some people will change the number of repetitions. Some weeks they'll go low repetition with high weight. Some weeks they'll go very high repetition with lower weight. But another thing you can do to get a muscle to respond is alter the ratio of time you spend in concentric versus eccentric contraction. So one thing you can do is do a very quick concentric contraction, maybe just for a count of 1 or 2 on the way up, and then do a very prolonged eccentric contraction, maybe a count of 4 to 6 on the way back down, or even longer. And it's a very effective way of challenging the muscle and getting it to respond, just because it's something different. And here we see a diagram of what we've been talking about using the bicep curl, the example we were just talking about. Okay. Our next topic is going to be called muscle metabolism. This is section 6 in the chapter. And in the topic of muscle metabolism, what we're going to talk about is, where does the energy come from to fuel muscle contraction? What is the source of energy for muscle contraction? And as we'll see, it's not a single answer. As muscles contract, there are actually several different sources of energy that they utilize as time passes. And so what we're going to see is that there's an initial source of energy, and then depending how long the contraction lasts, we start using alternative sources of energy as we exhaust the earlier forms of energy. Okay, now ultimately, of course, all muscle contraction depends on ATP. As we saw when we looked at what happens in the sarcomere at the level of the myofilaments, you need ATP to attach to myosin heads so that they can let go of the thin filament, reset themselves, and then continue to perform multiple power strokes. So ultimately, it all comes down to ATP. But ATP in a muscle cell will run out very quickly. The supply of ATP, the stored ATP that's in a muscle cell, is only enough to account for just a second or two of contraction. It's really very limited. So when we talk about sources of energy for muscle contraction, what we're going to be talking about is, where do we get the energy to keep remaking ATP as the muscles use it? They're going to use it very quickly, so we have to regenerate it, resupply it very, very quickly. And to do that, of course, we have to have sources of chemical energy to remake ATP as it's being broken down. And so what exactly we do kind of depends on whether we have oxygen available or not, and what kinds of organic energy sources we have. The most important energy sources for ATP for muscle cells are glucose and fatty acids. All right, so what do we do, at least initially? Initially, we rely on some stored chemical energy, and we rely on anaerobic mechanisms to begin with. Remember, anaerobic mechanisms do not use oxygen, but they're very inefficient. You can't generate a lot of ATP from, say, a molecule of glucose using anaerobic metabolism. But it is something that is very quick in terms of its ability to yield some ATP, again, at least very quickly. If we're going to have a sustained contraction, anything more than maybe 30 seconds or so, we're going to need to shift over to aerobic respiration. Remember, from intro bio, aerobic means utilization of oxygen. And notice we don't say anaerobic respiration. Respiration, the word respiration implies the use of an electron transport chain. Now, there is such a thing as anaerobic respiration, the electron transport chains that don't involve oxygen, but those aren't in humans. Those are in organisms like bacteria, for instance. So in humans, we only use electron transport chains in our mitochondria in the presence of oxygen. So we have aerobic respiration. What we do anaerobically has nothing to do with electron transport chains. Remember, again, from intro bio, anaerobic metabolism in humans involves the production of pyruvate and then recycling NADH through fermentation. And in fermentation, we produce the waste product of lactate or lactic acid. So at any rate, these are all the things we're going to be talking about. What are the initial sources of ATP for the first few seconds of contraction? And then how do we do anaerobic pathways for a few more seconds, and then for long-term duration, aerobic. And here we see a nice little model of how we deploy these different strategies. We start with, again, a few seconds, really a few seconds of just some stored energy, up to about, most books say about 6 seconds of activity can be supplied with stored ATP in something called the Phosphagen System, which we'll describe in a second. After 6 to 10 seconds, then we can rely on anaerobic metabolism for about another 30 to 40 seconds. And if that's the total duration of the activity, then we actually never have to technically employ aerobic respiration. So if we can get the activity done in about 40 seconds, somewhere in that ballpark, even if it's intense activity, we can rely on stored energy and anaerobic metabolism. But if we're going to go much more than 40 seconds to a minute, then we're going to need to utilize aerobic respiration, aerobic processes. And so if you think about this, you think about the kind of exercise that people do. If you just do weightlifting, especially powerlifting, where the goal is to lift as much weight as possible, and so therefore you don't have that many repetitions of the exercise, you're pretty much done within this 40-second window for any one exercise. And if that's what you do, then you are not going to see any significant gains in your aerobic capacity, because essentially all you're doing is doing 10 to 30 or 40 seconds of work, and then you're resting. You're letting these stored chemical energy sources recharge themselves, and you're getting rid of the lactic acid that's been produced using the bloodstream, and then you're ready to go again with a second set of 10 to 30 seconds or so, and you're pretty much constantly staying anaerobic. This is why people who just exclusively do bodybuilding or weight training and do it in that very traditional way of very short sets with long period of rest in between really are not in very good aerobic shape. They don't have a lot of endurance because they're just not training that way. On the other hand, if you're a marathon runner where you're working for sometimes 2, 3, 4 hours at a time, notice you're you're exceeding this 30 to 40 seconds by an astronomical amount. And so people who do things like marathons are obviously constantly training in this aerobic region, constantly increasing their aerobic capacity, because that's the kind of exercise they're doing. Now, it is possible to lift weights in an aerobic fashion, and that's a lot of what happens with cross training these days. So you reduce the weight, the amount of the weight, but you increase the duration with which you work with the weight. And so there are lots of programs out there. Insanity was one, P90X, CrossFit. All of these are trying to combine the benefits of weight training, where we're challenging the muscles, but also trying to get some aerobic benefit out of it by working the muscles more continuously. So hopefully that helps put all this in the context of how we challenge ourselves and some basic concepts of fitness. Alright, so again, starting at the very beginning of an intense exercise, say something like a 100-meter dash, which usually can be completed by most people within 30 seconds, and by world-class athletes within a 11-second period or so. What's going to happen? What's going on in the muscles for a short, intense exercise? Well, as we said, there is an initial supply of oxygen that can be used aerobically to make ATP, but again, that is rapidly depleted. And even though we have a molecule called myoglobin, which is like hemoglobin that stores oxygen in the muscles, we exhaust this oxygen supply almost instantaneously, within a second or so. And so what happens then is we turn to something called the Phosphagen System. And to make a long story short, what happens in the Phosphagen System is we use the ATP that's already in the muscle, again, which I said just supplies a few seconds of activity, and another phosphorylated material known as creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate represents a stored energy system. But again, stored ATP and stored creatine phosphate together, again, only allow for about 6 to 10 seconds worth of activity. Okay? Now, what is this creatine phosphate? We know what ATP is. We know that if we remove the high energy third phosphate from ATP and turn it to ADP, we release energy. So what's going on with creatine phosphate? Well, it's another high energy phosphate bond, very much like ATP. So what we see here is that, again, when we, in order to make ATP, we have to add a phosphate group to ADP. And we have a couple of ways to regenerate ADP back into ATP fairly quickly. One is called the myokinase system, which is an enzyme that's capable of pulling a phosphate off ADP and turning it into AMP, which is adenosine monophosphate. So we took the lower energy version of ATP and pulled even more energy off of it to make ATP. Well, this can only last so long because we continue continuing to convert ADPs to AMPs. We're eventually going to run out of ATPs, and there won't be any left to make ATP with. So this is a very short-term strategy that you don't want to use. You don't want to do too much, because you're going to eventually not just run out of ATP but also ADP. A more effective element of the phosphagen system, again, is this thing called creatine phosphate. And in creatine phosphate, what we have is an enzyme called creatine kinase that's capable of pulling the phosphate group off of the creatine phosphate, turning creatine phosphate into plain old creatine. What happens to that phosphate group that's been pulled off? It's a high energy phosphate group, and this enzyme will then add it to ADP to recreate or regenerate ATPs to fuel muscle contraction. So we're using creatine phosphate as a storage site for high energy phosphates that we can use to recreate high energy ATP. And again, this whole phosphagen system, the ATP that's the muscle has within itself, plus these alternative ways of remaking ATP, are only enough to fuel about 6 to 10 seconds worth of contraction. So for something like a 100-meter dash, if you can get it done in 10 seconds, then that may be all you'll need to get the job done. But anything more than 10 seconds, we're going to need an alternative way to recreate ATP, because again, we're going to run out of ADP and we're going to run out of creatine phosphate fairly quickly. Now, you've probably heard the word creatine before. It's a nutritional supplement that's very popular with weightlifters especially, and the idea is that creatine somehow helps build muscle and improve performance. My understanding at this point is that there aren't many, if any, reputable studies that show that creatine phosphate has any effect other than as a placebo. We know that it does tend to cause water to move into muscle cells more, alters osmotic balance, and that will make your muscles look a little bigger because they get more hydrated. But in terms of actually building myofibrils and affecting strength, I think there's very little data to show that it makes a real difference. And it just goes to show you, again, the power of the placebo effect. If you think something's going to help, oftentimes it helps, whether it really does or not. All right, so what happens after 10 seconds? What happens after 10 seconds and we run out of stored ATP, stored myoglobin, oxygen, and stored creatine phosphate? Well, then we have to go to anaerobic metabolism. Anaerobic metabolism. And we're not going to go too much into what this actually is. Again, this is something that you have learned about already in intro bio, but basically, again, you start usually with glucose, and we get glucose from the blood, and there's also stored carbohydrate in muscles called glycogen that we can break down quickly into glucose. And we do a process in the cell, in the cytoplasm and sarcoplasm, called glycolysis. And glycolysis can break down a molecule of glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvate. 2 molecules of pyruvate, or pyruvic acid, for every molecule of glucose that we begin with. And while there's a ton of potential energy in a molecule of glucose, perhaps enough to make over 100 ATP molecules in a perfect world, what we actually get out of it in anaerobic metabolism is 2 ATP. So it's not terribly efficient. It's got a less than 2% efficiency rate, but it is quick. And so we start using this anaerobic mechanism to quickly generate these measly 2 little ATPs for every glucose molecule that we consume. Now, remember, because of the second law of thermodynamics, we're never going to get that 100 or so ATP molecules that we potentially could get from glucose. But we should be able to do better than just 2 ATP. And of course, the answer is we can do better if we need to. And that's going to be aerobic respiration, which we'll get to next. Now, again, this is more detail than we need for this particular class, but in order to make glycolysis occur, you need to convert something called NAD plus into NADH. It just is it's another reaction that has to occur for glycolysis to continue. And like any other thing that's in limited supply in the cell, you can run out of NAD+. And so if we run out of NAD+, glycolysis grinds to a halt. So we have to find a way to take this thing called NADH, which is produced as a byproduct during glycolysis, and turn it back into NAD+. And the way we do that is through a process known as fermentation. Fermentation is how we recycle NADH back to NAD+. And that keeps glycolysis going. And what is the fermentation? The fermentation step specifically is where we take the pyruvic acid, or the pyruvate that's been produced by glycolysis, and turn it into lactic acid, or lactate. So we're not trying to make lactate, we're simply doing this fermentation in order to recycle NAD+ and keep glycolysis going. This is not the only way to do fermentation. This is known as lactic acid fermentation. There are other kinds of fermentation that other organisms can employ. For instance, yeast are famous for employing alcohol fermentation, where they produce ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide from pyruvic acid instead of lactate. And of course, this is why we love yeast, right? We use them to make alcoholic beverages through the process of fermentation. This is also why we add yeast to dough and let it rise. The rising of the dough is simply the production of the carbon dioxide gas during fermentation performed by yeast, and that's why breads and doughs have the air pockets in them. It's from the carbon dioxide produced by fermentation. But we don't do that kind of fermentation, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective. We do lactate fermentation. And again, this lactic acid builds up, and it could be a problem, potentially altering the pH of the muscle cell and inactivating enzymes. But under normal conditions, the lactate doesn't build up to that high a level because the circulatory system is capable of removing it from the cell and transporting it to the liver, where it is converted back to something less harmful. All right, so that's a sort of quick overview of how we get ATP from anaerobic metabolism. Again, not very efficient, but quick, and it gives us 2 ATP for every molecule of glucose we consume. We can perform anaerobic metabolism for another 30 to 40 seconds of intense activity. So again, if we have that stored system that gives us 6 to 10 seconds, the creatine phosphate stored ATP, etc., and then we can use anaerobic metabolism to support another 30 to 40 seconds of intense activity. All right, then what happens? Well, then what happens is we start to build up so much lactate that we have difficulty getting rid of it quickly enough, and the system starts to break down. And at that point, we either have to stop the contraction or we have to continue it with another source of ATP generation. And that next source and final source of energy for prolonged activity is going to be aerobic respiration. All right. So a couple of things to think about here. First of all, why do we just do about 40 seconds? Again, lactate starts to build up, and that's one problem, but that's not really the main problem. The main problem is up to about 40 seconds, we really didn't have much of an alternative because it takes time during exercise or intense activity for the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system to start delivering enough oxygen to fuel aerobic respiration or increased aerobic respiration. So in other words, if we wanted to do aerobic respiration to meet the needs of an intense exercise, we would need to start delivering more oxygen. Well, again, that would mean you'd need to start breathing heavier and faster, and your heart rate would have to go up to increase blood pressure and blood flow, and all that takes some time. So even if we wanted to, we couldn't just instantly start doing an increased level of aerobic respiration to meet the needs of exercise. It takes about 40 seconds or so to get enough oxygen into the blood and enough blood flowing to the muscles to the point where we can start increasing our aerobic respiration to meet the muscles' demand. But after that 40 seconds or so, aerobic respiration kicks in because the respiratory and circulatory system have kicked in as well and are now delivering high levels of oxygen. Now recall, aerobic respiration, the whole process, it begins with glycolysis, but then goes on to something called the Krebs cycle, and then finishes with an electron transport chain. And those other two processes, recall, take place in the mitochondria. So this is where the mitochondria of the muscle cells become important, because they are the site really of the aerobic portion of our metabolism. And again, as I said earlier, aerobic respiration is more efficient than anaerobic metabolism. Remember, glycolysis produces about 2 molecules of ATP for every glucose molecule we start with, but aerobic respiration produces about 30 ATP for every molecule of glucose. So it's much more efficient. We get a much higher payoff of ATP for every molecule of glucose than with anaerobic. So it is the preferable metabolic mechanism to use because of its higher efficiency. Again, notice it's nowhere near the 100 or so that we theoretically could get from glucose. But this is pretty good efficiency. Again, the second law of thermodynamics states that no transfer of energy is 100% efficient. You're always losing some as heat. And so 30 is about the best that you're going to see in nature. So what happens to the rest of that energy? It gets, of course, released as heat. This is why we get hot when we exercise, and this is why muscles are the principal source of body heat. It's because of this inefficiency dictated by the second law of thermodynamics. All right, so during the first few minutes, we increase our respiratory rate and cardiovascular function to increase rates of delivery of oxygen. And we get to a point after 3 or 4 minutes where now it should reach a stable point where we just maintain that steady state of increased respiration and cardiovascular function to keep pace with muscle contraction. For the first 30 minutes or so, the energy source for aerobic respiration comes from 2 sources, as we said earlier, mostly glucose and fatty acids. But eventually, after about 30 minutes or so, we start to run out of stored glucose and fatty acids in the cell, and fatty acids being delivered by the blood become the more significant source of energy. So for long-term exercise, like an exercise class, like a HIIT class or a old style aerobics class, or for duration exercises, again, like marathons, after about 30 minutes, we shift to fatty acids. Now, we don't talk about how fatty acids are utilized in intro bio. With fatty acids, essentially what you're going to do is take fatty acids, you're going to plug them into the Krebs cycle. So you bypass glycolysis, and fatty acids directly start getting plugged in at the level of the Krebs cycle, and then from there we finish on out with aerobic or electron transport. So we're still getting energy, just not starting with glycolysis. All right, so what we've seen is we have a few seconds worth of stored energy in the phosphagen system. Then we have about 30 to 40 seconds where we can, if we need to, support intense activity with anaerobic pathways. And then we hit a steady state of aerobic respiration that's going to support the activity potentially for a very long period of time, depending how intense the activity is. And again, this is where cardiovascular training comes into play. So most of us can walk for hours if we had to, taking occasional breaks. Marathoners can run for 2, 3, 4 hours. Now, not everybody can do that, of course, so that takes training, and you have to do the right kind of training to increase your aerobic capacity. That means not only increasing the capacity of individual muscle cells, but it also means training to improve the function of the respiratory system. It also means training to improve the function of the cardiovascular system. All of these things are involved in maintaining high levels of aerobic respiration. And so you have to do endurance training if you're going to have those high levels of activity over long periods of time. Most of us are not in that kind of shape, and we will get tired fairly quickly if we try to do intense activity, even with aerobic respiration, because we exceed our body's ability to support that kind of activity. But hours of moderate activity, for most of us, that's not a problem with aerobic respiration. Now again, if most of us try and run a marathon and try to do it in a 2-hour pace like a world-class marathoner does, we wouldn't last very long. We would be sucking wind, and our muscles would be aching, and our hearts would be pounding in our chests, and we would just have to stop if we tried to do it at that level. And so again, the respiratory system isn't up to the task, the heart isn't up to the task, but also the muscles themselves will experience something called muscle fatigue. So what is muscle fatigue? Again, it's progressive weakness in the muscle from prolonged use, especially prolonged intense use. It's associated with high intensity activity, usually. There's a lot of discussion out there about what causes muscle fatigue, and a lot of people think it has to do with lactic acid buildup, but that actually is not, doesn't appear to be the main cause of muscle fatigue. We're not 100% sure what exactly causes it, but there are several things that appear to be involved, none of which involve lactic acid. So we'll just look at some of the possibilities here. In high intensity activity, we think potassium will tend to accumulate in the T-tubules, because remember, during action potentials, potassium moves out of the cells. And in the T-tubules, it's hard for that potassium to diffuse away because they're inside the muscle cells. And so potassium imbalances build up in the T-tubules, and that reduces the excitability of the muscle. It's harder for it to do action potentials. And the more we produce ADP and inorganic phosphate, that starts to inhibit cross-bridge attachment. It starts to inhibit the action of calcium on troponin. And so those appear to be involved in fatigue at high intensity activity. In lower intensity activity, you can still get fatigued, especially if you've been going for hours and hours and hours. And that can result from some other things, loss of glucose and even fatty acids in some cases. You simply run out of fuel. Electrolyte loss through sweat, sodium, potassium loss through sweat, can alter ion concentrations, and that can affect action potentials in nerves and muscles. And then there's something called central fatigue. Central fatigue involves the nervous system more than it does involve the muscles. And there are a couple of ways in which central fatigue can occur. Exercising muscles release ammonia, and so that ammonia enters the bloodstream and can travel to the brain and inhibit brain cells. So there's a physiological kind of fatigue that can happen at this level. There's also a psychological fatigue that happens, where essentially you psychologically just simply run out of the will to continue. And so basically you psych yourself out and you say, you tell yourself you're done, perhaps even when you're not. And so we see examples of this where people kind of trick other people into one more rep when the person didn't think they could do it, and they pretend that they're spotting them or something when they're really not. So there is a psychology, and from what I've read, we generally psychologically fatigue before we actually physiologically fatigue. And it may be a protective mechanism to prevent these kinds of imbalances from occurring and totally actually inactivating the muscle. There is a maximum rate at which you can take oxygen up by your respiratory system and into the bloodstream. This is referred to as the maximal oxygen uptake. And this is the main determinant, one of the major determinants of how high a level of activity you can maintain for any duration. So it's the VO2 max is, as you can see here, the point at which the rate of oxygen consumption levels off, and you can't do any better than that. Your respiratory system and circulatory system can't deliver oxygen any faster than what they're doing. That's called your maximum oxygen uptake. And so at that point, if you try to increase your intensity, you're not going to be able to last very long because your system's already working at its maximum rate. And so if you want to sustain a workout, you have to find that plateau of effort that is basically perfectly matched to your maximum oxygen uptake, so you can continue and do the most work you can without exceeding it. But if you exceed it, you're going to feel the effects of that, and you're going to have to slow down or stop. And so endurance exercises are all about kind of trying to stay right at the VO2 max. The VO2 max is variable. It is proportional to body size, with bigger bodies. It is, of course, proportional to age. Sadly, it peaks around age 20, so it's all downhill from there. It's greater in males than females, again, effect of testosterone. And then finally, it does respond to training, as we've said. And so given all these other things, you can influence your VO2 max, your maximum oxygen uptake, through endurance training significantly. And notice here it says you can increase it by twofold if you are if you do endurance training. And of course, endurance training is training where you sustain activity for long periods of time. So again, weightlifting is not endurance training. If you do conventional weightlifting where you do a set and then rest for a long period of time and then do a set and rest for a long period of time. However, if you do less weight, higher reps, and don't rest as long in between, weightlifting, you can turn it into a kind of endurance training if you don't give yourself that much time to relax in between sets. Okay. There is something called excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. It's a mouthful, so it's usually abbreviated as EPOC. Basically what we're talking about here is that, let's say you're running on a treadmill and you've been running for a half hour, say, and then you stop. And you shouldn't stop immediately, but you should gradually reduce it and cool down. But let's say hypothetically you've been running for a half hour and then you stop. You just stop. What's going to happen? Will your heart rate fall back to resting immediately because you stopped? We know the answer is no. Will your respiratory rate fall back to normal just because you stopped? And again, the answer is no. We know that following exercise, our heart rate and respiratory rate do not return to normal immediately. It takes time for them to come back down. The reason it takes time is because we've built up something called this EPOC, this post-exercise, or we've built up technically something called oxygen debt. Oxygen debt means that after sustained exercise, we've got to replenish some things. We've got to replenish hemoglobin in the blood with oxygen. We've got to replenish myoglobin in the muscle cells with oxygen. We've got to replenish the stored ATP in the muscle cells, so we have that few second supply the next time we want to start. We've got to supply extra oxygen to the liver, which is of course working on breaking down lactate that we've produced. So we've got a lot of sort of excess oxygen needs following exercise. And so just because we stop exercising doesn't mean that we don't have to continue with a high respiratory rate and heart rate for a while. All right, and what we're doing is we're meeting the need for oxygen debt. And so this creates the need for excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. You have to keep consuming oxygen following the exercise. And again, in different people, depending on your training, EPOC can be large or small, and it can last for a few minutes to sometimes up to an hour, depending on, again, your endurance training. Generally, endurance trained athletes don't have as big an EPOC, and it doesn't take them as long to restore that oxygen, again, due to their training. Okay, that's a good place for us to stop. We are at objective 161 at this point. Next time when we get together, we'll start with 162, and we're going to talk about types of muscle fibers we have. Up to this point, we've been talking about muscle cells as if they're all the same. What we're going to see with objective 162 is actually we have different kinds of muscle fibers, which have traditionally been called fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers, and we're going to see what those two kinds of fibers are good for. Until next time, stay safe.